Dane Wigington with geoengineeringwatch.org. For an installment of Into the Wild, we try to document the abrupt climate collapse, imploding ecosystems around the planet. In a remote section on the east side of Lake Shasta, a place I've been trekking to for about 20 plus years. You see where I'm at right now, I should be 100 feet underwater, more than 100 feet underwater. It's already the end of the rainy season. We had exactly no rain the entire rainy season since last year until a day ago. We had a fraction of an inch, and you see it's already dry because climate engineering operations continue to cut off the flow of precipitation. These once magnificent trees, that's the remnants of a canyon live oak, strongest oak in the forest. Been here for nearly 100 years since this lake was first submerged, Lake Shasta. Doug fir remains, again, almost 100-year-old. Been underwater, but not so much anymore as the weather makers continue to cut off precipitation. This is nothing less than weather warfare. As you look up the canyon, the Pitt River, where it's historically flowed, you see the bare banks from where the lake should be, but isn't, and won't be, unless or until climate engineering operations are exposed and halted. When we have so-called elected officials, like Northern California's Congressman Doug LaMalfa, that has proposed to me in a meeting I attended, raising Shasta Dam to catch more water. What good would that do, Congressman LaMalfa, when climate engineering operations that you know about are preventing precipitation from falling here? We can't even fill the dam we have, even with barely a trickle flowing out of the bottom of the Sacramento River. And you know about these programs, Congressman LaMalfa. When will you show the courage to acknowledge them? That's looking up the Pitt River. Again, the skeletal trees left over from when this dam was first filled nearly 100 years ago. And for those from a distance, it might look like the forest looks okay. It's absolutely not okay. It's imploding by the day, and the die-off this year will be absolutely catastrophic. So let's go take a closer look at the forest. I'm going to ascend this bank, and let's take a look at the interior of the forest to see what it actually looks like up close. So many, even now, going about their lives as if nothing's wrong. It's always been incredibly perplexing to me. You know, I've been in this battle for over 20 years. For me, it feels like a treadmill that never stops. And when I'm fatigued, I feel like I'm going to collapse on the belt, hanging on the bar, my feet dragging on the belt. There's no other choice but to stand back up and keep going. So long as there's any bat, bird, bee, frog, bear still fighting to hang on, I'll keep doing my part. Just climbing with one hand here, so forgive any slips. What we have is global power structures taking unprecedented action because they know biosphere collapse is here. As geoengineeringwatch.org warned about for nearly the last decade and a half, biosphere collapse has beat the controllers to the intersection, and now they're taking desperate measures at warp speed. And that dot's not hard to connect. Global conflict, now also a part of the equation, as geoengineeringwatch.org said it would be. The power structure holds many cards, and they're certainly going to play them now, as they're out of options, because if the public wakes up to what's being done to them without their knowledge or consent, a grand and lethal experiment for which there is no return. Climate engineering operations now going on for over 75 years. And when you see a clear day like this, without aerosol operations occurring, that's what we see typically after a weather front moves through. We get a day or two reprieve because conditions aren't conducive for them to seed solar radiation management operations, so we get a slight break as weather fronts move in. That's when the weather terrorists fully unleash the aerosol spraying assault. That's where I just came up from. You see the Pitt River winding down. All of that should be underwater. Let's take a close look at what the forest looks like when one's near enough to see what's actually occurring here. And we have weather disseminating agencies, climate engineering cover-up agencies like the Weather Channel, AccuWeather, Weather Central, and the rest, covering the tracks of the climate engineers. The public, all too willing to have the truth hid from them until the last possible moment. And I've been frequenting these remote sections of forest for about 2 decades. In fact, that shelter is when I built a temporary shelter out of trees that were already down about 2 decades ago. They're still holding because they're not deteriorating. The forest floor duff, the biomass on the forest floor, also not deteriorating because the soil microbiome is being killed by the contaminants in the rain. Aluminum, barium, strontium, manganese, polymer fibers. Now we know graphene, chemical isonucleating elements that are used to flash cool areas. That's why we go from 80 degrees to sometimes snow, back to 80 the next day. How obvious could this be? This is engineered winter. This is winter weather warfare. So as we come inside the forest, it looks like it's not that bad from a distance to too many people. What's it look like when you get up close? Take a good look. This section of forest was once a closed canopy, completely closed. It's never been logged, never been touched. This is old growth forest. It's completely imploding. And we're told by official agencies, so-called experts, that this is all just because not enough trees are being cut down. And that's why the forests are burning, and that's an absolute blatant lie. Although thinning an understory is necessary in some cases, and most especially after irresponsible logging operations have decimated the forest, in areas like this there was no understory for hundreds of years, perhaps thousands of years, and yet now we see everything dying. It's sickening for me to come here. And what happens when everything dies? Then you have an understory that begins to erupt, and in this case with a non-indigenous species. This is Scotch broom. It's completely taking over the forest floor. The game can't move through it. It's completely altering the ecosystem. And the single greatest causal factor for forest die-off is climate engineering. It's completely disrupting the hydrological cycle, destroying the ozone layer. We face functional ozone layer collapse mathematically, statistically, in as soon as 18 months. We're getting not only UVC in the surface now, as Geology Watchdog has disclosed for nearly a decade, we're now detecting some X-ray. I don't think I need to explain how lethal that is. When you see a specimen like this ponderosa, it's now stone dead. Perhaps a 400 or 500 year old tree. That's absolutely sickening to me. And how many people think that if they can still go to Walmart and grab a burger from McDonald's and everything's fine, when it's anything but. This is a mixed hardwood and conifer forest, so we have a great variety of trees here. It makes this forest more resilient because forests are completely dead in many parts of the world. 70-80% die-off. This area, because it has madrones, a tropical looking tree, because the normal annual rainfall where I'm at now would be about 70 or 80 inches. Again, since last year, We've had a fraction of an inch that occurred yesterday, and it's already dry. Nothing else. And we're almost all the way through the rainy season. So now, instead of the rainy season here being about 8 to 9 months long, it's about 2 months long. And broken up by hot, dry weather. And that's what you get. That's what you get. This was completely closed canopy. And the ancient sentient beings that once stood here, like that very old specimen of Ponderosa, now gone. And yes, the beetles do play a part once the tree is all but dead. Up close, some of the beetle galleries visible here in the Cambrian layer of this bark. But the beetle's only a symptom of a tree that is too sick to defend itself now. This is why the forest burns are happening with such intensity. And it's not an accident that climate engineers are cutting off precipitation. Think about it. We know that the US military had the ability to flood regions at will in the 60s. Project Popeye. Historical record. Not my opinion. In fact, they were so successful at it that by the latter 70s, in-mod treaties, environmental modification treaties, forbid weather modification in wartime, but not over a country's own population, and nobody pays attention to international law anyway. So now you have this overgrown, completely fuel-laden understory waiting for the first spark to set it off. And for the trees that don't die while they're standing, the root systems are also dying. We know from peer-reviewed study that bioavailable aluminum affects root systems. They sense the toxin. They shut down nutrient uptake. So you have trees tipping over at a far larger rate than they ever have before. One example, root system completely decomposed. Trees tipped over. This tree tipped over when it was alive, and you see the amount of debris on the forest floor. And again, as you look up, all of this was completely closed canopy. And now the sun is beaming through. The intense UV is scorching any organism that can't take that kind of heat. And even the firs that are still alive are dying. Every tree you see here will be dead by the end of this year. They're thinning. 1 or 2 of those ponderosas may survive. You see the dead trees. These are all Doug fir. Different type of beetle eats the fir. And again, the madrones are holding up better than other trees, but the entire fir forest is succumbing. It was a primary tree in this forest. There's many challenges that we face, but the most dire challenges are directly related to the imploding biosphere. And why are so few acknowledging that? Geoengineeringwatch.org is the only source that I'm aware of that is attempting to expose the engineered winter weather whiplash that the controllers create, sensationalize headlines to confuse and divide the population as to the true state of die-off until the last possible moment while they try to complete their plans in preparation. And that's what they're doing. And there is global collusion and cooperation on the core issues like CV19 and climate engineering. It can't be otherwise. These operations couldn't be conducted otherwise. The narrative couldn't be maintained otherwise. Another fall tree, rotted root system. And as we head into the forest further, again, it's just more carnage, collapse. So where do we go from here? If we don't expose climate engineering operations, an effort that will take all of us, if the planet's not allowed to respond to the damage already done on its own, mathematically, statistically, we have no chance, none. And that doesn't mean centuries out, that doesn't mean decades out. It's here. Collapse is a given. An example I've used many times because it's very clear. If you have a vehicle going 100 miles an hour and it's 5 feet from impact, You can put the brakes on all you want, you're going to hit. And that's exactly where we're at. The question now is, will anyone survive the ride to the bottom of the canyon? Because we are definitely through the guardrails. You see how bad this forest looks. If you were to see what it looked like 15 years ago, 20 years ago, it'd be unrecognizable. Now I'm standing on some of the sentient beings that once stood here. I never wanted this job. I wanted to work in the forest restoring habitat, which I've done on a very large scale, working with state and federal agencies, project which I ran on the east side of Lake Shasta, habitat restoration, 6 projects in total, 3 state, 3 federal, and there's no point anymore. I wanted to stay here and work in solitude after those programs were over and continue to work on my own, but how could I? Knowing what I knew, learning this from my own solar uptake that was declining astronomically. Sometimes 60-70% of my solar PV uptake diminished from the aerosols being sprayed in our atmosphere. Climate engineering is diminishing all 3 primary forms of alternative energy: wind, hydro, and solar. The particles block direct sunlight. That radically affects solar PV uptake. It disrupts the hydrological cycle, so now we have hydro dams all over the world that don't have enough water to produce anything. And because climate engineering affects convection, it affects wind, and thus diminishes the production of wind farms. But not to say that these renewable energy forms are actually renewable. They're not. They're an alternative form. But in fact, they are absolutely not renewable. They will absolutely not save us. Tech is not saving us. Tech is what has brought us to this point, at least in the manner it's used and the technology we have. I can hardly come to this place anymore. And you see the bark popping off the fir trees because the Ips beetles have gotten underneath the bark in the Cambrian layer, and the rest of the forest is on its way down. And again, all of this was treed at one point, about 10 or 15 years ago. So what's the bottom line? What do we do at this late hour? Do we give up? Would we give up if our child was in a burning house and we knew we had very little chance to save that child? I don't know any parent that would give up. None. But yet, when it comes to the imploding biosphere on which all of our lives depend, most especially our children, how many roll their eyes and walk away and pretend it isn't so because they're officially told it isn't so? As if we can expect anything from our governments, which are nothing more than state-sponsored mafia, anything but lies and total deception. And this is what we have for a forest now. Another fall tree here. This is a recent fall. Large ponderosa. And he snapped off that far up the tree because the chemically ice-nucleated frozen material, I won't dignify it by calling it snow, sticks to the crowns of the trees like cement. The first wind that blows, they snap or blow over. I loathe what I have to do to try to sound the alarm. I loathe that I have to visit these sections of forest that breaks my heart to frequent and see. But my hope is this, that at this late hour, if enough realize the gravity of what's unfolding, if enough realize that everything is at stake, and that just because many don't like Al Gore or the environmental groups, and nor do I, that doesn't mean what's happening isn't happening. People like Al Gore played exactly the part the power structure wanted him to play, to make the public have such disdain for him that they take the opposite position of anything and everything he says. And the environmental groups, trying to protect their 501c3 nonprofits, are ignoring climate engineering. We know this at Wigington.org because our attorneys have spoken to their attorneys. They won't touch the issue because they don't want to lose their nonprofit status. The epitome of total hypocrisy. We will sink or swim together, and hiding in the cabin of the Titanic or one's own cabin on a sinking ship won't save you. If we have any chance of changing course, it starts with exposing the biggest hole in the bottom of the boat, the greatest and most immediate threat we collectively face, short of nuclear cataclysm. And that threat is climate engineering. And even with nuclear cataclysm, climate engineering is tied to that because it's destroying our ozone layer. And we're now susceptible to a CME, coronal mass ejection, that would shut down nuclear plants around the globe. And if that happens, we have Fukushima times 1, 2, 300. How many nuke plants are located at sea level? They're going to be underwater soon. What happens to them? That question's not hard to fill in. We must prioritize. We must learn to conduct this battle as the colonists did, from behind rocks and trees. We don't need to be organized and lined up like the British. One can expand the circles of awareness around them, and that is best accomplished by sharing credible data from a credible source. We offer printed materials at geoengineeringwatch.org that are the most effective at waking others because of the photography in them, because of the images that are shown, documents that are shown. A picture's worth 1,000 words, as the proverb goes. If you can wake those around you and have them do the same, and we can expand those circles of awareness, those spot fires of awareness, until they merge into a bonfire that can't be put out by the power structure, until the criminal media, that's nothing but minions for the power structure, are exposed for their part in the cover-up of these crimes. It's up to all of us to do this. And if we look at this mathematically, if one woke up 2 of their circle on the beginning of a 30-day month by sharing credible data, and those 2 woke 2 up each the second day, and so on for 30 days, we're into many millions. It's 5 or 6 million at that point. That's how we reach a critical mass of awareness. If we can do that, we can possibly stop these programs from the inside out by waking those up that are participating in these programs that are being told they're doing something benevolent, which couldn't be further from the truth. They're participating in their own near-term self-extermination and the extermination of their own children. We're rapidly running out of time. We must again deal with the biggest hole in the bottom of the boat first. We must expose climate engineering. And again, these operations, highly toxic elements, we're inhaling it with every breath we take. It's affecting our neurological systems, our cognitive ability. And now we know we have graphene in that. Graphene's a biological carrier. What might that be being used for? That blank's not hard to fill in either. We are literally in a fight for life. Please, please make your voice heard. Make every day count. This is Dane Wigington with geoengineeringwatch.org.